Story 11. The Vanishing Jogger. I've always been a creature of habit. I'm not ashamed to admit that my mornings follow the same ritual, down to the minute. Alarm at 5:45 a.m., black coffee, a banana, and then out the door by 6:15 for my morning jog. I take the same trail near my neighborhood, a quiet stretch of dirt paths cutting through a wooded park. It's peaceful there at sunrise. I barely ever see anyone except a few other regulars, nodding silently as we pass. I guess we all like the routine. Last year I started jogging to clear my mind after a messy breakup. Running became my therapy, my escape. I know that trail like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. That morning nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. The air was damp with leftover mist, and my sneakers kicked up faint puffs of dirt as I hit my usual pace. About 10 minutes into the run, I noticed her. She was maybe 50 feet ahead, jogging with a steady rhythm, lean frame, dark hair tied back in a low ponytail, wearing a bright red jacket. At first I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people used the trail, though seeing someone so early was rare. I remember thinking her jacket stood out sharply against the muted greens and browns of the woods. Then, without warning, she veered off the path into the trees. It wasn't gradual either. One moment she was there, jogging along the trail, and the next she darted to the side like someone had called her name. I slowed down as I reached the spot where she disappeared, my breathing heavy but steady. There was no trail leading into the woods, just dense trees and underbrush. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone cut through there? I stopped for a moment, scanning the woods, half expecting to see her jogging deeper inside or circling back to the path. Nothing. The forest was silent except for the faint rustling of leaves. A cold, inexplicable unease crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe she's taking some shortcut I don't know about, I thought, trying to convince myself it wasn't weird. Still, as I picked up my pace again, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder, half hoping to catch a glimpse of red. The rest of my jog was uneventful, but the woman in the red jacket stayed in the back of my mind. I didn't see her again the next day or the day after that, and I started to forget about it. Then, about a week later, as I was walking home from work, I spotted something on the lamppost near the corner of my street. It was one of those missing person posters, and my heart nearly stopped. It was her. The same dark hair, tied back just like I'd seen it, and a face that looked eerily familiar. I stared at the poster, reading the details like I'd misread something, but no. Her name was Emma Caldwell, 28 years old, missing for over 2 weeks. My blood ran cold. How could she have been missing that long? I'd seen her. She was right there, jogging ahead of me just days ago. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her face on the poster. The details swirled in my head. Last seen wearing a red jacket, dark leggings, running shoes. It was her. There was no mistake. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd seen her poster before and subconsciously imagined her on the trail. That seemed logical, right? But the thing was, I hadn't noticed any posters until that day. And the way she jogged ahead of me that morning, so real, so normal, didn't feel like something my brain could have conjured. I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something was terribly off. The next morning I was back on the trail. I told myself I was just imagining things and that fresh air would clear my head. But this time I was hyper-aware of everything. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made my heart race a little faster. I was halfway through my run when I felt it again. I wasn't alone. I looked ahead and there she was. Emma. The red jacket stood out like a warning sign, bobbing steadily as she jogged. My mouth went dry. She was moving at the same pace as before, almost identical. I slowed down, watching her carefully this time. I wanted to call out to her, say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Then, just like last time, she darted into the trees. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my ears. It was the same exact spot. The same sudden, deliberate movement into the woods. I stood there, staring into the trees where she disappeared, trying to make sense of it. My instincts told me not to follow, but curiosity gnawed at me. I stepped off the path and pushed into the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and legs as I moved deeper. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vast silence of the woods. There was no reply. Just the soft creaking of trees swaying and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. After a few minutes, I stopped, realizing how far I'd wandered. The air felt colder here, heavy like a weighted blanket. I turned back, retracing my steps until I found the trail again, but something didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that Emma had vanished twice, it was that everything felt wrong. The woods were too quiet, the trail too empty. I finished my run in a daze, glancing over my shoulder the whole way home. That afternoon, I went online and searched for news about Emma Caldwell. Her case had made headlines locally. Friends described her as kind, someone who loved running and spent most mornings on that very trail. But the most chilling part? The police believed she vanished during her morning jog. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of red darting into the trees, followed by that overwhelming silence. By morning, my logical brain had started spinning again. It has to be a coincidence, I told myself. Maybe someone else wore a red jacket, or maybe I was so caught up in the missing person story that my mind was playing tricks on me. Determined to prove myself wrong, I went back to the trail, half hoping I wouldn't see her again. But as soon as I turned the first bend, there she was. Emma, jogging ahead of me at the same steady pace, her red jacket bright against the dull colors of the woods. This time I forced myself to move faster, closing the distance between us. My breath was ragged, but I didn't care. I needed to see her face to prove to myself that she wasn't real. But as I got closer, something strange happened. The air around me grew colder, and the light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, as if the world itself was pressing in. I was just 20 feet away when she turned her head ever so slightly, like she knew I was there. Her face was pale, and though I couldn't make out every detail, I swear her eyes looked hollow, empty. I stopped dead in my tracks as she turned back and for the third time veered sharply into the woods. I stood frozen on the trail, every instinct screaming at me not to follow. But I couldn't help it. My legs moved on their own like I was being pulled forward. I stepped off the path again, pushing through the trees. This time, the woods felt darker, thicker, as if the branches were closing in around me. My breaths came shallow and every sound, my footsteps, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. "Emma?" I called out again, though my voice was barely louder than a whisper. I didn't know what I expected. A response? Another glimpse of her red jacket? But the deeper I went, the more suffocating the silence became. Then I saw it. A flash of red caught between the trees, maybe 50 feet ahead. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I moved closer, my shoes sinking into soft earth that felt too wet beneath me. The jacket was draped over a branch, hanging like someone had carefully placed it there. My skin prickled and I felt eyes on me, an undeniable sensation of being watched. I spun around, searching the trees, but saw nothing. Just empty woods. I grabbed the jacket, almost without thinking, and a cold, sharp gust of wind tore through the clearing, rattling the leaves. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so close it could have been right behind me. My body turned to ice and I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was out of the woods and back on the main road, lungs burning, the jacket clenched tightly in my hand. I don't even remember how I got home. The whole way I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see her, or worse, something else, following me. When I finally stumbled into my apartment, I threw the red jacket on the floor and collapsed onto the couch, my heart pounding. I didn't want to touch it again, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Up close, it looked old, dirt-streaked, and torn in places, like it had been sitting out in the woods for weeks. That whisper I heard out there still echoed in my mind. It hadn't been words exactly, but it felt like a warning. I didn't go back to the trail the next day, or the day after that. For the first time in over a year, I broke my morning routine. I avoided the posters, the news reports, anything that might remind me of Emma Caldwell. but the jacket was still there. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, and every time I walked past it, I swear I felt that same cold gust of wind from the clearing. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up to a sound. A soft, rhythmic thudding like footsteps. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was coming from the hallway, slow and deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The moment the beam hit the floor, the sound stopped. But something else caught my eye. The red jacket was no longer on the living room floor. I sat frozen, staring at the empty spot where the jacket had been. My flashlight beam darted around the room, searching. I didn't want to move, but I forced myself to get up, my feet unsteady as I stepped into the dark hallway. "Hello?" My voice came out weak, cracking in the silence. I inched forward, my light catching on something at the end of the hall. There it was. The red jacket. It was draped neatly over the doorknob of my front door, like someone had placed it there deliberately. My skin crawled. I grabbed the jacket with trembling hands, yanked open the door, and threw it outside into the cold night. I slammed the door shut, locking it twice, then stood there, my back pressed against the wood, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow looked wrong. But when morning came, I dared to peek outside. The jacket was gone. Not lying on the ground or hanging from the trees, just gone. That was weeks ago. I haven't been back to the trail since. I've started driving to a gym across town instead, where the worst thing I have to deal with is bad pop music. But sometimes late at night I'll hear something faint outside my window. Soft, rhythmic thuds, like footsteps moving along the pavement. I never look. I just close the curtains and wait for it to pass. Whatever happened in those woods, whether it was Emma or something else, I don't think it's done with me yet. Story 12. The Late Night Delivery. Back in 2019, I was working as a food delivery driver to make some extra cash while juggling college classes. It wasn't a glamorous gig, but the late night shifts paid well because no one else wanted them. I'd zip around the city in my beat-up Honda, listening to true crime podcasts to keep myself awake. That particular night, a Friday, I remember it clearly, I was already dead tired by 11 p.m., but a big tip popped up on the app. The order was for a single meal, a burger, fries, and a drink. Nothing unusual except the delivery address was in a part of town that always felt off. It was one of those neighborhoods where half the houses were empty, boarded up, and the streetlights flickered like a bad horror movie. As I drove closer, my gut started doing that twisty thing it does when something feels wrong, but I shrugged it off. Work is work, right? I pulled up to the house, number 314, and immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The place looked abandoned, peeling paint, overgrown yard, no lights on. But my phone buzzed before I could second-guess myself. It was the customer. "I'm inside. Just come in," the message said. I stared at it for a second, my brain stumbling over the words. Delivery drivers don't go inside. Ever. I texted back, "I can leave the food by the door." No response. Just silence, with my engine humming softly in the empty street. I sat there for another minute, debating what to do. The app was still open, showing the delivery as waiting to be completed. I texted the customer again, more firmly this time, "I can't go inside. I'll leave the food out front." Almost immediately, my phone buzzed again. "No, please. I'm inside. Just come in." Something about that message made my chest tighten. The desperation in it didn't feel right. I glanced up at the house, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The curtains in the upstairs window were slightly pulled back, just enough for me to make out what looked like a shadowy figure standing there. I blinked and looked again, but it was gone. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but for some stupid reason, I hesitated. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe just the pressure of needing that tip. I grabbed the bag of food, stepped out of my car, and stood at the bottom of the cracked concrete steps leading up to the porch. "Hello?" I called out, my voice coming out shakier than I'd like to admit. The night was so still I could hear the sound of my sneakers shifting on the gravel. No answer. I tried the doorbell, but it didn't work. Of course it didn't. That's when I heard it, soft, slow footsteps coming from somewhere deep inside the house. I froze, heart hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I backed away from the door, my hands suddenly clammy around the food bag. Those footsteps weren't hurried or loud, just deliberate, like someone wanted me to hear them. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the street, but the place was dead silent. No cars. No lights. Just me, the abandoned house, and whatever the hell was inside. I was about to drop the bag on the porch and bolt when my phone buzzed again. I'm upstairs. I see you. I swear my heart stopped. I didn't want to look up at that window. Every part of me was screaming not to, but my body moved on its own. The curtain in the upstairs window twitched, and for the briefest moment I saw it. A figure. Pale face. No features I could really make out, just there. Watching. My stomach dropped and I stumbled back a few steps, nearly tripping over my own feet. Screw the tip. Screw the job. I turned on my heel and was halfway to my car when I heard it, loud and clear this time. A thud. It sounded like something heavy had fallen inside the house, close to the front door. I didn't stop to look. I practically dove into my car, throwing the food bag into the passenger seat as I locked the doors and started the engine. As I fumbled to pull away, my headlights swept across the front of the house. That's when I saw it, just for a second, a figure standing on the porch. It wasn't there when I turned around. It wasn't moving either. Just standing. A tall, blurry silhouette like it was waiting for me to change my mind. I hit the gas so hard my tires squealed, and I didn't let up until I was a couple of blocks away. My breathing was shallow, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the steering wheel. I pulled over to the side of the road, my car idling as I tried to calm myself down. It's nothing, I mumbled to myself. Some prank or something. Kids screwing around. But I couldn't stop picturing that pale face, or whatever I thought I saw, watching me. Then my phone buzzed. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped it. When I looked at the screen, I felt my stomach twist into a knot. It was another text from the customer. Why did you leave? You didn't deliver the food. My skin prickled and I swear the temperature in my car dropped. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I wanted to tell them to leave me alone, to scream at them through the phone, but I didn't. Instead, I marked the delivery as completed on the app and turned my phone off completely. I didn't care about the bad rating or the lost tip. I just wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. I drove home with the radio cranked up, hoping the noise would drown out the thoughts racing in my head. Every shadow on the road looked like someone standing there. Every flicker of a street light made me jump. By the time I parked outside my apartment, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. I grabbed the food bag from the passenger seat, I had forgotten it in the chaos, and was about to throw it in the trash when I noticed something odd. The receipt on the bag had the customer's name, H. Holloway. I don't know why, but seeing that name made my skin crawl. It felt old, like it belonged to someone who shouldn't still be placing food orders. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow, every text message. Around 3 a.m. I finally drifted off, only to wake up an hour later to the sound of my phone buzzing. I had turned it off earlier, but now it was on again, the screen lighting up my dark room. My heart sank. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look, but I did. There was a new message. No name. No number. Just one sentence. You forgot something. My blood ran cold as I noticed the attachment, a blurry photo taken through my car window. It was me sitting in the driver's seat, staring up at that cursed house. I dropped the phone like it burned me and stumbled out of bed, my chest tight. Someone had taken that picture. Someone at that house had been watching me the whole time. My brain was racing with questions I didn't want answers to. Who took the photo? How did they get my number? My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I even say? Hi, I got a creepy text after delivering food to a haunted house? They'd think I was insane. I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking, trying to convince myself that it had to be a prank. Maybe some tech-savvy weirdo who lived there got off on scaring delivery drivers. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I stayed up with every light in my apartment on, checking the locks on my doors and windows over and over. By the time the sun rose, I almost believed I had imagined everything. But when I grabbed my phone again, the message was still there. I stared at it for a long time, the blurry image of me staring back. That's when I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen the night before. In the corner of the photo, just behind my car, there was a faint figure standing at the edge of the driveway. Not just a shadow or a trick of light. A person. Or something that looked like one. At that point, I knew I couldn't just shrug this off. I deleted the message and blocked the number, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I avoided that part of town completely, refusing any deliveries that took me near it. For a while, nothing happened. No strange texts, no photos, no pale figures in the shadows. I started to convince myself that it was just some elaborate prank, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after too many late nights. Then about a week later, I opened my front door to leave for work and froze. Sitting on my doormat was the same bag of food I had tried to deliver that night. The receipt still had the name Aid Holloway, and the burger and fries inside were cold and rotting. I don't remember much about what happened next. I think I screamed. I definitely threw the bag as far as I could, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I called the cops after that, and while they were polite enough to come check it out, there wasn't much they could do. The food was gone when they arrived, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. They suggested it was probably a prank from someone who knew where I lived, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Neither did my friends. "You've been listening to too many horror podcasts," they joked. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Story 13. The Replacement Worker. It was late September, and I remember the office being quieter than usual. Most of my coworkers had left hours ago, but I was stuck at my desk, trying to finish a last-minute project that was due the next morning. My name's Julie, by the way, and at the time I was 27, working as a junior analyst in a small corporate office. I wasn't unfamiliar with staying late. Our department was notoriously understaffed, and deadlines didn't care about anyone's schedule. That night, though, there was something about the silence that felt heavier. The usual hum of the air conditioning seemed louder, and every creak of the building made me flinch. I shook it off, convincing myself I was just tired and needed to focus. Around 9:30 p.m., I heard the sound of a door opening somewhere in the hallway. I looked up from my screen, surprised. As far as I knew, I was the only one left in the building. My office space was in a far corner near the windows, so I couldn't see much of the hall without standing up. The footsteps that followed were soft, deliberate, almost careful. Before I could think too much of it, a man appeared in the doorway. He was pushing a cleaning cart and wore a standard janitor's uniform, dark blue with a name tag on the chest. "Oh, sorry to bother you," he said, smiling warmly. "Didn't realize anyone was still here." His voice was calm, friendly, and his demeanor put me at ease almost instantly. "No worries," I replied, sitting back in my chair. "I'm just finishing up. Haven't seen you around before. Are you new?" He nodded and gave a small chuckle. "Yeah, first week here. I'm just covering for someone else tonight." He glanced around the office as he spoke, his gaze lingering on the cubicles and empty chairs as if he were mentally noting everything. "You're a hard worker, huh? Staying this late can't be easy." There was nothing strange about what he said, but something about the way he looked at me, really looked at me, made my skin prickle. I smiled politely and shrugged. "Deadlines don't wait, right?" He laughed again, but it was softer this time, almost to himself. "True enough. Well, I'll get out of your way." As he started pushing his cart down the hallway, I couldn't help but watch him. Something about him seemed off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like he moved too quietly, even for someone trying to be considerate. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. Long nights in an empty office building could play tricks on anyone's mind. Besides, he seemed harmless enough, just a guy doing his job. Still, as I turned back to my screen, I found myself glancing toward the door every few minutes, half expecting him to come back. About half an hour later, I heard it again, the same soft footsteps, this time closer. I turned toward the hallway and sure enough, there he was, standing just outside the doorway. He wasn't pushing the cart anymore, and I noticed his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He tilted his head slightly as if studying me. "Still here, huh?" he said, his voice quieter this time. "You really don't quit?" I let out a nervous laugh, trying to act casual. "Almost done," I replied. "Just tying up some loose ends." He smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good," he said softly. "Don't work too hard." I watched as he turned and disappeared down the hallway again, but this time I felt uneasy. His words, though innocent enough, carried an odd weight that I couldn't shake. I checked the time, 10:15 p.m., and decided it was time to wrap up. I saved my work and started shutting down my computer when something caught my eye. On the desk just across from mine, there was a faint smudge, a streak of something dark, on the otherwise spotless surface. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned in for a closer look. It wasn't just a smudge. It looked like a fingerprint, smeared and faint, but unmistakable. My mind raced. I didn't remember seeing that earlier, and why would there be fingerprints? The janitor had a cleaning cart. Wouldn't he have wiped that down? Feeling increasingly uneasy, I grabbed my bag and decided I'd had enough for the night. As I made my way to the elevator, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. The hallway was empty, but the silence was suffocating, like the walls were holding their breath. I jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, silently urging the doors to hurry up and open. When they finally did, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator doors began to close, and that's when I saw it, a shadow at the end of the hallway. It was faint, just a shape standing still, but I knew it was him. My stomach twisted, and I slammed the closed-door button harder than I ever have in my life. The elevator ride felt like it lasted forever. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and the soft hum of the elevator only made it worse. When the doors finally opened onto the lobby, I practically ran out, the sound of my heels echoing sharply against the marble floors. The building was completely empty, just rows of dark offices and empty chairs. I paused at the security desk, considering telling someone about the janitor, but who would I even tell? The guy didn't do anything wrong, not really. I was probably just overtired, letting my imagination run wild. I shook my head and hurried out into the cool night air. The next morning, I came into the office feeling embarrassed about how shaken I'd been. I joked to a couple of coworkers about my late-night paranoia and mentioned the new janitor, the one who'd been covering for someone else. That's when my friend Sam, who's been with the company for years, gave me a weird look. "What janitor?" he asked. I blinked at him, confused. "The guy last night," I said. "Dark blue uniform, name tag, cleaning cart." He said he was covering for someone. Sam shook his head slowly. "Julie, the cleaning service hasn't sent anyone new. No one was scheduled to clean last night." My stomach dropped. "That doesn't make sense," I stammered. "I talked to him. He was here. I saw him." Sam's expression turned serious. "Are you sure, Julie? Because no one's been in this building after hours for weeks. We've been handling the cleaning during the day." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. The memory of the janitor's quiet footsteps, the smudge on the desk, and that shadow in the hallway all came rushing back. Suddenly the air felt too thin and I had to sit down. "I'm telling you, Sam," I whispered. "He was here." Sam didn't say anything else. He just watched me like he wasn't sure if I was messing with him or losing my mind. I spent the rest of the day distracted, barely able to focus on my work. At one point, I walked over to the desk where I'd seen the fingerprint the night before. It was gone. The surface was spotless, like it had never been there at all. I ran my hand over it, half expecting to feel something, anything, but there was nothing. That night, I left the office on time, refusing to stay late again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something or someone I wasn't supposed to. And the worst part? I never found out who or what he was. Weeks passed, and the memory of that night started to fade, or at least I convinced myself it did. I stopped talking about it, stopped bringing it up with my coworkers. The rational part of me told me it was just exhaustion, a trick my mind played on me when I was overtired. But every once in a while, late at night, when the office was quiet and I was alone, I'd hear something. A soft shuffle, the faint sound of footsteps. I never saw him again, but I always wondered, what would have happened if I had stayed even later that night? And sometimes I'd catch myself staring down the hallway, half expecting to see that shadow still standing there, watching. Story 14. The Locked Park Gate. It was the summer after high school, and I remember feeling invincible, like nothing could ever touch me. My best friend Danny and I were in that weird limbo before college, with endless nights and no real responsibilities. We lived in a quiet town, the kind where everything closes by 8 p.m. and you know every crack in the sidewalks by heart. One evening, out of sheer boredom, Danny suggested we check out the old Sycamore Park after dark. I laughed at first. Everyone knew the place was off limits after sundown, with big red signs that screamed "Park closed, no entry." But Danny was good at making bad ideas sound fun. "What's the worst that could happen?" He grinned, shining his cheap flashlight in my face. Famous last words, right? We hopped the fence near the east end of the park, where the street light was broken, and the darkness stretched endlessly ahead of us. I'd been to Sycamore Park plenty of times during the day, picnics with my parents, soccer games as a kid, but it felt different at night. The trees seemed taller, the branches tangled together like bony fingers, and the paths were swallowed in shadows. Everything was too still. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under our feet and the occasional buzzing of insects. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I shook it off. "Don't be a baby," I muttered to myself. Danny, of course, was his usual fearless self, stomping through the overgrown paths like we were on some grand adventure. As we wandered deeper into the park, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, like the shadows were moving just a second too late or the air had dropped a degree or two. Danny kept joking around, shining his flashlight into bushes and calling out, "Come out, ghosties." I forced a laugh, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Footsteps. Not ours. They were slow, deliberate, and matched us step for step. I stopped dead in my tracks, grabbing Danny's arm. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He turned to me, still grinning but with a bit less confidence now. We stood there, frozen, listening to the stillness. Nothing. Just the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Danny rolled his eyes. "Man, you're paranoid. Let's keep moving." But I knew what I'd heard. We kept walking, this time a little faster, and I couldn't help but look over my shoulder every few steps. The flashlight flickered, barely cutting through the dark, and the path ahead looked more like a tunnel than a trail. That's when I heard it again, those footsteps. Closer this time, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's reach. I spun around, shining the beam into the trees, and I swear I saw something. A figure. Tall and still, standing just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. My stomach dropped. "Danny," I whispered sharply, still pointing the flashlight toward where I thought I saw the figure. "There's someone there." He stopped walking and turned around, peering into the dark with squinted eyes. "Where?" he said, his voice a little too casual to be real. I couldn't answer. My throat felt dry and the light in my hand shook slightly. After what felt like forever, Danny sighed and said, "There's no one here, man. Relax." But as he turned back around, I saw it again. A quick movement in the shadows, like someone slipping behind the trees just out of sight. It wasn't my imagination. I knew someone, or something, was following us. We picked up our pace without saying a word, the mood shifting completely. The path felt endless, and the flashlight's beam seemed weaker, almost like the darkness was swallowing it. Then we heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a sharp, deliberate snap of a branch off to our right. We both froze, and Danny whispered, "Okay, that was real. Someone's messing with us." My chest tightened as I looked around, my brain racing for an explanation. Maybe some other kids were pulling a prank? Or a park ranger caught us sneaking in. But no one stepped forward. The silence stretched again, heavy and unnatural, and all we could hear was our own breathing. "Let's get out of here," Danny muttered, finally sounding nervous. We turned around and started heading back the way we came, but it felt like the path was twisting on itself longer than before. The flashlight flickered again, and I cursed under my breath. Danny walked faster, his usual bravado replaced with silence, his shoulders tense. That's when we heard the footsteps again, this time louder, quicker, and following us without hesitation. I glanced back and saw nothing but darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Run," I said, barely louder than a whisper. We bolted, stumbling over roots and rocks, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of us. It didn't matter where we were going, we just had to get out. When the main gate finally came into view, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. But as we reached it, that relief turned to pure panic. The gate was locked. A thick, rusted padlock hung on the outside, chaining the bars together. I grabbed the gate and rattled it as hard as I could, yelling, "Hey, is someone out there?" No answer. Behind us, the footsteps stopped. Danny shined the flashlight back down the path, his hand trembling, but the beam hit nothing but empty trail and trees. "How the hell is it locked?" he stammered, yanking at the chains. I didn't have an answer, but I knew we weren't alone. We stood there, backs against the cold metal bars of the gate, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel sweat sliding down my back even though the air felt ice cold. Danny was muttering something to himself, yanking on the lock like it might magically break apart. That's when we heard it again, the footsteps. This time they didn't stop. They were steady and slow, coming closer and closer, and I swear they sounded heavier, like someone was dragging their feet. I tried to shine the flashlight in every direction, but it was useless. There were too many shadows, too many places for someone to hide. Danny whispered, "Whoever's out there, you'd better quit messing with us." But his voice cracked, and I knew he was just as scared as I was. Then we saw it. A figure stepped onto the path about 20 feet away. I couldn't see its face, but its shape was unmistakable, a tall, thin silhouette standing perfectly still. It didn't say a word. It didn't move. It just stood there staring at us. I could feel my chest tightening like a fist was squeezing my ribs. "What do you want?" Danny shouted, but there was no response. The figure tilted its head slightly, just a little, like it was studying us, and I felt my stomach drop. The flashlight started flickering again, dimming with every second. "This can't be happening," I whispered, more to myself than to Danny. Danny grabbed my arm, his voice low and urgent. "We've got to move. Now." "But where?" The gate was locked, and there was no way I was running deeper into the park. The figure took one slow step forward, and I swear I heard the gravel crunch beneath its feet. My legs felt like they were made of concrete, but I forced myself to move, pulling Danny toward the side of the gate. There was a smaller gap between the bars where kids used to squeeze through during the day. It wasn't much, but it was our only option. I dropped to my knees, fumbling with the flashlight as I tried to squeeze through. My shirt snagged on the metal, and I swore under my breath. Behind me, Danny hissed, "Hurry up, man." As I scrambled through, I turned back just in time to see the figure step closer, now barely 10 feet away. For the first time, I got a good look at it, or what I thought was it. It didn't look quite human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, like a puppet on strings. But the worst part? Its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Where its eyes and mouth should have been was just smooth, pale skin stretched tight like wax. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't look away. Then Danny pushed me through the gap, snapping me back to reality. Go. Go, he shouted, scrambling behind me. I fell onto the pavement outside the gate, the flashlight clattering to the ground. Danny tumbled through the gap right after me, landing hard on his side. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and turned to look back through the bars. The figure was still there, just a few feet away now, standing completely still. It didn't try to follow us, didn't make a sound. It just stood on the other side of the gate, staring at us with that featureless face. My pulse was racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, slowly, it raised one arm and pointed at us. I don't know why, but that simple motion filled me with more dread than anything else that night. I grabbed Danny's arm and pulled him up. We have to go. Now. We ran down the street as fast as our legs could carry us, the park shrinking behind us into darkness. I didn't stop running until we were 3 blocks away, standing under the glow of a flickering streetlight. Only then did I realize how hard I was shaking. Danny was hunched over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. What the hell was that? He managed between breaths. I couldn't answer. I didn't want to. My mind kept replaying that moment, the figure's slow, deliberate steps, its smooth face, and the way it pointed at us. We stood there in silence for a long time before Danny muttered, "We're never talking about this again, okay?" I nodded, though I knew I'd never be able to forget. We walked home in silence that night, too shaken to talk about what we had just seen. When I finally got to my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. I kept thinking about that figure. The way it moved. The way it stood there pointing. Like it knew something I didn't. I tried telling myself it was just someone messing with us. Some weirdo in a mask trying to scare off trespassers. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was no way to explain the unnatural way it moved or the feeling it left in my chest, like something heavy had been lodged there. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think Danny did either. The next day we went back to the park. I don't know why, maybe to prove to ourselves that it was all in our heads. But when we got there, the gate was wide open, the padlock gone. It looked normal again, like nothing had ever happened. We walked around the entrance for a minute, but neither of us dared to go inside. I spotted something on the ground near the gate. My flashlight. I must have dropped it when we ran, but when I picked it up, I noticed something strange. The handle was ice cold, even though it had been sitting in the sun. I handed it to Danny without saying a word, and he felt it too. We didn't go back to Sycamore Park after that. To this day, I still don't know what we saw or why the gate was locked that night. But sometimes when it's late and I'm alone, I swear I can hear footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, like someone is still following me. Story 15. The Silent Passenger. I've been driving for rideshare apps for about 3 years now, mostly on weekends or late nights to make some extra cash. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills and gives me a weird sense of freedom. You meet all kinds of people, drunk partiers, chatty business travelers, and the occasional weirdo who doesn't say a word. I've seen it all, or at least I thought I had. This happened about a year ago on one of those long, quiet nights where time seems to drag. It was mid-November, a little past 2 a.m., and I was about ready to call it quits when I got a ping for a pickup. The location wasn't far, a quiet residential street, but there was something about the name on the app, just PR. No picture, no rating. Normally, I'd skip that kind of ride, but I was tired and just wanted to make a few extra bucks before heading home. When I pulled up to the pin, the street was completely empty. No street lights, no houses with lights on, just a long stretch of shadow and cold air hanging heavy on the windshield. I double-checked the app. The address was right, and I was about to cancel the ride when a figure appeared out of the dark. I almost jumped. It was a man, or at least I think it was. He wore a long dark coat that billowed around him slightly as he moved, like it was heavier than it should have been. He didn't make eye contact or say anything, just opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me. I gave my usual awkward greeting, "Good evening. Headed to Maple Drive, right?" He didn't respond, just stared out the window, his face obscured in the reflection of the glass. I wasn't in the mood to push conversation, so I shrugged it off and started driving. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. I've had plenty of silent passengers before, but something about this guy made the silence feel off. It wasn't just that he wasn't talking, it was like he wasn't there at all. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, hoping he'd give some sign of life. A cough, a shift, anything. But he just sat there, completely still, his head turned toward the window. His face was hidden in the shadows, and the way the faint streetlights passed over him didn't help. I could feel my skin prickling, that instinctive feeling you get when someone's watching you, except he wasn't. He was fixated on whatever was outside, and it made me uneasy. To shake it off, I turned on the radio, just something to cut the tension. Static. Of course. I fumbled with the dial for a few seconds, trying to find a station, but the signal was shot. I gave up and turned it off, gripping the wheel a little tighter as I checked the app for the time. The ride was supposed to be 12 minutes, but every second felt like an hour. At one point, I cleared my throat and asked, "You good back there, man?" The question sounded strange even to me, and I immediately regretted asking. No response. I felt my pulse speed up as I forced myself to focus on the road. I told myself he was just one of those passengers. Maybe he'd had a bad night, maybe he was drunk and trying to hold it together. But then I realized something that made my heart stop. I hadn't heard him breathing. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking. I cracked the window slightly to let in some air, hoping it would help me snap out of this strange unease. The cold breeze hit my face, grounding me, but it didn't do anything to lighten the atmosphere. I snuck another glance in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. The guy was still sitting perfectly still, staring out the window, but now his head had turned just a little more. Almost like he was listening. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. I focused on the road and drove faster than I probably should have. Maple Drive wasn't too far now, just a few more minutes. I repeated that in my head like a mantra. A few more minutes and you'll drop him off. You'll never see him again. But as I turned onto the final stretch of the route, I swore I heard something from the back seat. It wasn't words exactly, more like a low whisper, like someone talking to themselves. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I tightened my grip on the wheel and glanced into the mirror again, my voice shaky as I muttered, "What did you say?" This time the man moved. He shifted slightly in his seat, just enough for me to see his face in the reflection, except I couldn't. His face was still hidden, swallowed up by the dark, but the absence of detail was worse than anything I could have imagined. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the dim light, that I just couldn't see him clearly through the rearview mirror. I forced my eyes back to the road, my pulse hammering so hard in my ears that I could barely hear myself think. Almost there, I muttered under my breath as if saying it out loud would somehow speed up time. But then I heard it again, the whispering. Clearer now, low and rhythmic, like the hum of a far-off chant. My throat went dry and I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to turn around, but I couldn't help it. Something about that whispering gnawed at me, pulling me in. Slowly, I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and the back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes so hard that the car skidded to a stop, tires screeching on the empty road. My heart was thundering in my chest, and my hands were shaking against the wheel. I turned my head, staring directly at the back seat this time. Nothing. No man. No coat. The door was still shut, and there was no sign that anyone had ever been there. I sat frozen, my breath ragged, trying to process what I was seeing, or not seeing. For a moment I sat there, completely paralyzed. The car was dead silent except for the faint hum of the engine and my own uneven breathing. I turned back to the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I'd imagined him. Maybe I was just exhausted and the late hour was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the memory of his coat rustling as he got in or the low whispered voice I'd heard just seconds before. My gut told me I hadn't been alone in that car. I forced myself to keep driving. Maple Drive was only a minute or two away now, and I just wanted to get out of there. I'll be honest, I didn't even know what I was planning to do when I reached the drop-off. Part of me was terrified that I'd look in the mirror again and see him sitting there, staring at me. Another part was afraid I'd find nothing, which somehow felt worse. When I finally pulled up to the address, it was a small, dark house that looked completely abandoned. There were no lights on, no cars in the driveway, just a sagging porch and tall, unkempt grass that swayed slightly in the breeze. I put the car in park and sat there for a few seconds, staring at the house. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years. This has to be a mistake, I whispered to myself, but the app still showed the drop-off as complete. I didn't want to linger, but a strange sense of duty, or maybe curiosity, made me glance into the back seat one last time. It was still empty. Relieved, I let out a shaky breath and reached over to end the ride on my phone. That's when I heard it again. The whispering. It was faint at first, like it was coming from somewhere far away, but it grew louder. I felt the sound vibrating in my ears, low and rhythmic, like someone was right behind me, murmuring words I couldn't understand. My chest tightened and I froze. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head to look into the back seat. For half a second, I swore I saw a shadow there, a dark shape just barely visible in the dim light. And then it was gone. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving me sitting there in complete silence again, my heart pounding in my chest. At that point, I'd had enough. I didn't care if it made me look crazy. I slammed the car into drive and peeled away from that house as fast as I could. My hands were clammy against the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there again, staring at me. The drive back felt endless. I turned on the radio, desperate for any noise to drown out the silence, but it was still all static. I couldn't escape the sound of my own breathing, short and shallow, like I'd just run a marathon. When I finally pulled into a gas station a few miles away, I parked under the bright lights, trying to calm down. I turned off the engine and sat back, hands shaking. "It's fine," I whispered to myself. "You're just tired. You imagined it." But then I glanced at my phone and my blood ran cold. The app still showed the ride as active. It said I had a passenger in the back seat. My throat tightened as I slowly turned to look, but the back seat was empty, completely empty. I stared at the phone, the words "passenger on board" glaring back at me. I couldn't move. My first instinct was to end the ride manually. I tapped the complete trip button on the app, but it wouldn't respond. The screen froze, stuck on the map and that unsettling notification. Passenger on board. My heart thudded so hard in my chest it felt like my ribs might crack. I turned the phone off and on again, desperate for it to reset, but when it powered back up, the app reopened on the same screen. My eyes darted to the back seat, lit up by the fluorescent lights spilling into the car. Still empty. Nothing there. I swallowed hard and ran a shaky hand through my hair. I wasn't staying in that car another second. I opened the door, stepped out, and leaned against the hood, breathing in the cold night air like it might wash away the fear curling in my stomach. A few other cars sat at the pumps, their drivers completely oblivious to whatever was happening to me. I thought about asking someone for help, but what could I say? That a ghost had been in my back seat? I'd sound insane. I checked the time, 3:17 a.m., and for a moment I considered abandoning the car and calling a cab home. But I knew I had to face it, whatever it was. So I climbed back into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and pulled up the app one last time. The app had finally reset itself. The passenger on board notification was gone, and the map returned to the normal home screen. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen as if it might change again. Slowly I exhaled, forcing myself to calm down. "It's over," I whispered, though my voice didn't sound convincing. I glanced into the back seat one last time just to be sure. Empty. Completely empty. The air in the car felt lighter now, like whatever had been there was finally gone. I pulled out of the gas station and headed home, my eyes flicking nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. When I got back to my apartment, I parked and sat there for a minute, too drained to move. The night had been unreal, and I kept trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened. A glitch in the app? A hallucination from exhaustion? Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I stepped out of the car and glanced at the back seat one last time before locking up. It was empty, of course, but there was something lying on the seat. A single dark button, like the kind you'd find on an old coat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The button sat perfectly in the middle of the seat, small and unassuming, but it felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there. My mind raced. I knew that seat had been empty when I checked earlier. There was no way I missed it. I leaned closer, hesitant, my fingers hovering above it. It looked old, worn around the edges, the kind of button you'd find on a heavy wool coat. This coat. A shiver crawled down my spine as I snatched my hand back, suddenly afraid to touch it. My gut told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't stop staring, my thoughts spiraling. Had he left it? Was it a sign or a warning? Eventually, I grabbed a tissue from the glove compartment and carefully picked up the button, wrapping it like it was toxic. I wasn't about to bring it into my apartment, so I tossed it into a trash can near the curb. As I walked up the stairs to my place, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing by my car, or worse, in it. But there was no one. Just the faint hum of the streetlights and the wind whistling through the empty lot next door. I locked my door the moment I got inside, bolted it for good measure, and collapsed onto the couch, too shaken to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man sitting there, silent, unmoving, his face hidden. I kept hearing that whispering, low and indecipherable, like it was buried somewhere deep in my mind. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, but eventually exhaustion won. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through the blinds, I almost convinced myself it was just a bad dream. Almost. That is, until I went outside to check my car. The first thing I noticed was the faint smudge on the back window, like someone had leaned their head against it. I hadn't seen it the night before, but now in the light, it was clear as day. My stomach turned. I checked the back seat again, half expecting to find another button or something worse, but it was clean. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that someone had been watching me. I spent the next few days avoiding late-night rides altogether, taking only daytime fares, but the memory stuck with me. Even now, a year later, I still think about it whenever I glance in my rearview mirror at night. Weeks passed and I tried my best to forget about that night. But no matter how hard I pushed it away, the unease lingered like a splinter buried deep beneath the skin. I'd catch myself checking the back seat more often, even during the day, just to make sure it was empty. Every shadow, every shape reflected in the rearview mirror made my heart skip. Worse, I swear I started hearing whispers when the car was silent, faint murmurs just at the edge of hearing, like someone was still there, still watching. Then one night, I finally worked up the nerve to drive late again. I told myself it was fine. Lightning doesn't strike twice, right? But as soon as I picked up my first fare, I felt it. That same heavy silence. The passenger was just a regular guy, but I couldn't help glancing nervously in the mirror, half expecting to see someone else behind him. My chest tightened with every mile, and when I finally dropped the guy off, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I glanced into the back seat out of habit. Empty. But when I turned back to the road, I froze. A faint whisper echoed through the car, coming from nowhere and everywhere. I whipped around, my pulse spiking, but the back seat was empty, again. The whispering stopped the moment I turned, like it knew I was listening. My hands shook on the wheel, and I felt that same prickling chill I'd felt the night of the man in the coat. My instinct screamed at me to get out of the car, but I stayed frozen, staring at the back seat like it might move. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I forced myself to drive home. That was the last night I worked as a rideshare driver. I couldn't do it anymore. Whatever I'd picked up that night hadn't let me go. Even now, I still think about it. I sold the car a few months after that night, convinced it held on to something I didn't want to take with me. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night in my new car, I'll hear it again, the faintest whisper, almost too quiet to notice. It's never clear, just a soft, rhythmic murmur that curls around the edges of my mind. I'll glance in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding, expecting to see a shadow sitting silently in the back seat. I never do, but I swear I can feel it. Like whoever, or whatever, was in my car that night is still out there waiting for someone else to pick them up. I tried to move on, but the memories never left me. That button, the whispering, the feeling of being watched. None of it made sense, and that's what haunted me the most. I even started looking into local legends or stories about Maple Drive, desperate for answers. There wasn't much, just the usual tales of abandoned houses and ghost sightings that people pass around to scare kids. But then I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. A forum post from years ago written by another driver described the exact same thing. A silent passenger, an empty backseat, and that house on Maple Drive. The details matched too perfectly to ignore, down to the whispering in the button. That driver had stopped driving altogether, too shaken to go near the area again. The post ended with a warning: if you pick him up, don't look back. Whatever you do, don't turn around. I shut my laptop, my hands trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd experienced wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was something tied to that road, that house, or maybe to me. I don't know. All I do know is that some nights, when it's quiet and dark, I still feel like I'm not alone.